This lecture will be on integrating quotations, basically how you use quotations in a paper or to a certain extent to a presentation. So first of all, before we talk about quoting directly, as in like quoting someone's exact words, we need to talk a little bit about how it's important, even when you're referring to someone's ideas without quoting them directly, you still give them credit, right? That's still important. And part of knowing when to quote correctly is knowing when you should just summarize something or you should just paraphrase something. Always making sure, though, to give credit to the person whose ideas you're using. Now, the quotes I'm going to be referring to here are all from A Student's Guide to History by Jules Benjamin. So, first of all, we have the idea of summaries. And according to Benjamin, summaries are drawing upon ideas that spread across several pages and restating these ideas briefly in your own words. And you can kind of think about that's like a macro view, right? You're just taking multiple pages of information and just summarizing it very briefly. Usually you're cutting out like the evidence and just focusing on the topic sentences, just focusing on the main ideas. So for example, you're kind of summarizing someone's ideas when you're saying, this scholar said X, Y, and Z about my topic. Here's how I'm going to build on what that scholar did, right? So you may be referring to a whole section or even their whole article, and you're just summarizing it to let people know how you're building on their ideas. Paraphrasing's a bit different. That's when you're capturing the meaning of just a few sentences from a source. It's more of a micro view. It's maybe isn't even that much shorter, but for whatever reason you want to kind of revise it, maybe make it a little bit more clear, maybe to emphasize something you think is important, but that's paraphrasing, more micro view. In both those cases, though, you still need to cite even though you're not quoting, right? You're still using their ideas, you're just making them shorter, revising them a bit. Now, why would you do this? Why not just use a direct quote? Well, the purpose is to give the reader important information while using space sufficiently and well. You don't want things to, you don't want to get bogged down. And like I said, you might be just need a, you maybe can just summarize 3 or 4 pages of someone's information that is important for your argument in just a couple sentences. It doesn't make sense to quote 3 or 4 pages from an article. You summarize it, you give the citation, people who want more information can go to the article. But basically, this is how you would summarize, this is how you would paraphrase, and this is where I got the information from. I mean, if this is a section on how to quote, I better actually quote correctly. So when would you quote? Right? When do you quote? When an authoritative source says something very important. Right? When an important source has some very important information for your argument, for your paper, then it makes sense to quote it. When the author uses striking language that might be lost in a paraphrase, right, or a summary, just, you could just summarize what that author says, but they say it so well. Like, you would just be making it worse. Like, there's no way to make it better, so why not just quote them? Right? And that's perfectly fine. You can quote someone and then refer back to their argument that they're making. It's also important, I think, when an author makes a controversial claim. For example, if in your paper you're saying, Smith says X, and I disagree with Smith. I think Smith is wrong in saying X, and I'm going to show that Smith is incorrect in my paper. It's important to actually quote Smith. Sometimes when people disagree with someone, they don't really take their argument seriously. Oftentimes they're unfair, and they make their argument weaker than it actually is. You've probably had someone do that to you. So it's important to give them space, to be fair, to actually say what they mean, and then you can say how they're wrong. Right? So someone says something controversial, says someone you're going to disagree with in your paper, you should quote them so we can see their exact words to make sure that they're actually saying what you say they're saying. And I have caught students they said, well, this author said X, and I look back and it's not what the author said. And that was embarrassing for the student because I caught them in a presentation doing this. If they would have actually quoted what the author was saying carefully within context, that never would have happened. And you also want to quote when you're going to analyze the quote in detail. So if you're writing a paper about Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, you need to actually quote sections of the Gettysburg Address and then analyze them, right? Then you can analyze them. So if you're going to analyze something, you need to give us the quote. And we need to capture the atmosphere or context in which the quote is given. Sometimes it's kind of hard to explain. The more primary source research you do, you'll get this feeling, but you can tell that people wrote differently in different time periods. You can kind of say like, oh yeah, that was clearly written in the 50s, that was written in the 20s, that was written in the 1890s. You get that feeling, and different historical periods have almost like a smell or atmosphere or feeling to them. And it's important sometimes to immerse your reader in that history, and it makes sense then to include a quote that has that kind of language, right? You know, if you want someone to get a feel for what's like in the 40s, you quote someone from the 40s. So these are all reasons why you would want to quote. Now I need to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how this works. So this is a quote from an article of mine, and it's important to understand the order of quotation marks, punctuation, and footnotes. So typically periods and commas go inside quotation marks even if they were not there originally. That is so counterintuitive, right? You know, I mean, logically you would say, but the period or the sentence is not, or the comma is not there. Why would I put it inside the quotation marks, right? And that's a very good point. I can just tell you that's not how things are done. So even though civilization here, I'm quoting someone, they use the term civilization, that was not the end of their sentence. This is the end of my sentence though, so I still put the period inside the quotation marks. If it was appropriate to put a comma there because I wanted to continue saying something, I would have put a comma inside those quotation marks. So you can add commas, quotation marks, question marks, exclamation points as needed. Footnotes always go at the end of quotation marks. So the order is period or other punctuation, quotation marks, footnote. Right? That's very important. Just to make things even more confusing, there are other punctuation rules, and I made up this kind of silly sentence to make my point. Dr. Rausch said commas and other punctuation go inside of quotation marks, comma, quotation marks, right? But then he went on to say that that is not the case for semicolons and colons. Semicolon goes outside. They go outside of quotation marks. So typically periods, commas go inside quotation marks. Semicolons and colons go outside quotation marks. I'm not sure exactly why this is done. I'm just telling you that this is Chicago style. This is the correct way of doing things in a history paper. Now, sometimes you want to use something called a block quote. Let's say you're quoting something that's rather long. And in that case, you want to set it apart so it's easier for the reader to see that this is a quote. So usually if something's going to take 4 lines or longer, right? So if this takes, more than 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, that's 3 lines right there. If it takes more than that, then it should be a block quote. And the way you do this, first of all, is you indent both sides by 1/2 inch, right? Notice there's an indentation there and an indentation there. That's 1/2 inch. It depends on who you're dealing with. Different journals and people are different about this, but the font size should either be the same or 1 step smaller. So if this is 12-point font, this should either be 12-point font or 10-point font. Usually I think it's better just to keep it the same font size. I don't think it makes it easier to read by making the font smaller. Typically it should also be single spaced. Notice that this is double spaced. The block quote is single spaced. Also, the quotation marks inside don't change. So notice here that there is a quote within the quote. Very dynamos of spiritual power. Those quotation marks stay there. They do not change. Right? So in a block quote, when you have quotation marks, those quotation marks change. Later we'll talk about how you quote a quote that's not within a block quote. This gets a little bit complex. That's why I have a section on it. So just to kind of show you how you can do all this, I just told you this is what you do, the way you do all this, here's what this looked like originally, right? This is the sentence leading into the quote. This is the quote. This is the sentence after. So what you would do is you would highlight this, and then on the home, this is Microsoft Word, you would choose paragraph. That will give you these options. And notice this is indentation, and originally it said 0.0. I changed it to 0.5. Left, 0.5 right. That's how you indent half an inch. And then under line spacing, you can change it to single, to double, however you want to do it. And that's how I did that. And then you end up with this. Right, this is the correct way that you would have this quoted. Now, we need to talk about how you deal with quotes within quotes. So this is a quote from Father Capon. This is the original. I am most grateful that I had special training in Catholic University concerning youth and character. And it's in quotation marks. So that's his quote. Notice he wrote something and he used quotation marks. I want to quote him, and there's a quote within his quote. How do I deal with that? Quotation marks. I am most grateful that I had a special training in Catholic University concerning youth and character. Notice, to mark what his words are, I have double quotation marks here, double quotation marks here. To mark his quote within a quote, I have single quotation marks. And then to preserve, remember I said the rule was that with exclamation points, periods, those go within the quotation marks. That goes here. So these double quotation marks become single quotation marks. Right, this is very important thing that you want to do. Now, what happens if someone makes a mistake in something that you want to quote? Like, let's say they misspell a word. So on one side, it feels like you should correct that. But this is a quote, right? You're not really supposed to change quotes, excepting punctuation for reasons. How do you deal with that, right? You don't want people to think that you made the misspelling or you made the mistake, but you also don't want to correct to change what someone actually said. Well, this is how you deal with it. So let's have a look at a quote. This man who was held in such high esteem, respected, admired, and loved was a real threat to our communist captors. This is about Father Capon. They could bully us around and practice their theory of the means justifying the end, comma, etc. Now, what he must have meant was the ends justifying the means, right? As it stands, this doesn't really make sense. The means justifying the ends. I think this person and this is from an interview, he just misspoke. And the interviewer faithfully wrote down what he said, but he made a mistake. He misremembered the saying, and the correct saying is the ends justify the means. Now, I need to respect the quote. I need to make sure that I quote things accurately, but I also don't want people to think I'm the one that made the mistake. So what I do is I add after the mistake in brackets, I add the word sic, S-I-C, and this is from a Latin term that signifies that this was a mistake in the original. So that's how you deal with that, right? Right after the mistake, you add brackets, and then in italics, you write S-I-C. And notice here also we have the quote, double quotes with single quotes to show that he himself was quoting. Note that when you have the single quote, the quote within a quote coming at the end, you have single quotations and then double quotations, right? The single quotation should always be within the double quotation. So it has to be in that order. Double quotation, opening, single quotation, opening, single quotation, closing, double quotation, closing. Now, what happens if you want to include part of a quotation, but not all of it, especially when it's in the middle, right? How do you do that? You deal with that using something called an ellipsis. And this is basically just 3 periods in a row. So we have this sentence, this part I wanted to quote. For instance, one Jewish POW who had been very close to Father Capon stressed that as a Jew, his, quote, feelings for Father were not clouded by any religious affiliation. So what happened was the person I'm quoting said a bunch of stuff that wasn't directly relevant to what I wanted to emphasize. I wanted to emphasize how this person, when he looked at Father Capon, was not influenced by Father Capon being a Catholic priest. It was clearly based on his relationship being pure man to man. So to show that I was removing material to make it easier on the reader, I added the ellipses. So someone reading this will know, okay, he took some information out. Maybe I should check on that to make sure he's quoting him correctly, but this just makes it easier to understand. So if you want to show that you're taking out words, that's how you do it. Now, how do we add words? Let's say that we have a quote and the quote doesn't quite work grammatically, but if we were to make it longer, it would make it harder to read, right? The quote doesn't work grammatically, how we have it, but if we make it longer, it makes it harder for the reader to read. In that case, we can add words using brackets. So here we go. I need to keep this short because it messes up the flow of the article. So what I did was, to make this make sense, was based purely on a man-to-man. I added in brackets the word basis. That tells the reader that, okay, in the interest of clarity and making things flow, the author has added a word to this quote to make it make sense. I do that by putting it in brackets. And as a general rule, whenever you see brackets within a quote, that means someone has added something. And like I said, notice sick to show there's a mistake also appears in brackets. So just keep that in mind. Now, let's say that you want to add additional information within a quote, right? So this is a translation. A friend of mine and I were translating this classical Chinese into English. So this is, we don't have a quotation marks here, but this is a quote. We don't put quotation marks in it because it's pages and pages of translation. But I included this to show you how you use parentheses to add information. So in this sense, at that time, Pak Yong-hyo was deeply concerned about the critical situation. So we added two things. First of all, we added his name in the Chinese. So people, and that's typical whenever you're dealing with China, Korea. The first time you mention a name, you add the sinographs, the Chinese characters, so people know how to find it. But also in history, usually when you mention someone, you give the years that they lived. And because it's a range, you use an N dash, not a hyphen. But the key thing is it doesn't matter. If you want to include some information within a quote and that gives explanation, if you're adding words, you use brackets. But if you're adding information like an explanation, you can do that either in a footnote or in parentheses. All right, so if you need to provide additional information, you do that with a footnote or with parentheses, as we've done here. We've given you some extra information about Pak Yong-hyo. Now, this last issue is a very special case. So let's say that you're reading a book and they have some information in there from someone else. So you're reading an author and the author quotes someone else. And for whatever reason, you don't have access to that source. So let's say that you're reading an article in English about Mexican history, and the author refers to a document that she has translated from Spanish and actually quotes that document. You want to use that in your paper because it's a really cool quote. You maybe don't read Spanish. Maybe that was like in the archives in Mexico City and you can't go down to Mexico City in order to access that document. So what do you do? Right? What do you do? So and I have to stress, you have to be very careful about this. Because someone reading you want to quote this person, they have important information. You can't read the Spanish anyway, maybe. Or even if you can read the Spanish, you can't get down to Mexico City. How do you deal with this information? You can quote it, that's fine. But you have to be careful to differentiate who is actually saying what. So to give you an example why this is important. So a student wrote a paper and they were looking at racism. And they quoted an author who was quoting someone else. So you had a professor who wrote a book and they quoted someone who was really, really racist and they said something incredibly racist. But the student, the way they referred to it made it sound like the professor was saying this really racist thing. But it wasn't the professor who was saying it. The professor quoted someone who said it in their book, and the student wanted to use that quote, and it was perfectly reasonable for the student to use the quote. It made sense. But the key thing was the student made a mistake because they made it look like the professor said this really, really racist thing when in fact it wasn't the professor who said that at all. They were just quoting someone. So what you do, you have to be very careful that you explain in the text that who you are quoting. You don't just quote something and don't say something. So instead of just saying, this is the quote, you would say, 18th century slave owner said this. And then it's clear, it's not the professor writing the book that was published in 1990 that said it, right? It was the 17th, 18th century slave owner who said that. And then in the footnote, when you cite this, you actually give the information, the primary source information first. So you would quote that 17th century, 18th century person. And you would have that citation information because you have the person who wrote the book should have provided it, right? They would have said, I got this from the Mexican archives. It's in box 4, file 3. You would just put that in there. And then you would write quoted in and give the book where you got that information, right? So the professor wrote the book, got the quote from box 4, folder 3 of the Mexican archives. You would put that first. Then you would add quoted in, and then you would say, the history of Mexico by Juan Diego or something like that, right? That's how you would deal with that. Even if the format's not exactly correct, that's something we can deal with. This is a very rare case, but it's important because you don't want to make it look like someone said something that was really terrible when in fact they never said it, right? They were just quoting someone who did. And even if it wasn't terrible, it's still important in history to know who said what.